Welcome to I Got Stuck, a catalog of temporary obsessions, with me, your host, Dr. Kelly Reedy, wherein each week I'll give you a full report on the latest topic that's kept me up at night. Things that have led to countless hours of procrastination through Googling, asking Jeeves, and navigating the twistiest and turniest of internet rabbit holes. By the way, rabbits often sleep with their eyes open. Speaking of sleeping with eyes open, I love haunted hotels. I seek them out. I haven't had any big-time ghost encounters, but I love that in supposedly haunted hotels, the history, or some version of the history at least, is often really front and center. Beats a Holiday Inn Express any day. And also, I love boats. So you can imagine how happy I was to learn recently that America's most haunted hotel is a boat. The Queen Mary. It's a retired ocean liner that's now permanently docked in Long Beach, California, and it's been turned into what Travel and Leisure magazine says is America's most haunted hotel. First of all, let's talk about ocean liners. They're giant boats similar to cruise ships, but historically, they were more often used for transporting people from point A to point B on a regular schedule in lieu of faster methods that we have now, like airplanes. So it was like a commuter boat. That being said, you definitely shouldn't try to picture the ship version of a commuter train. Definitely don't think about New Jersey Transit right now. Ocean liners could be really fancy. The Titanic was an ocean liner, for example, so you can picture it. Or better yet, just look up some pictures of the Queen Mary from its early days, which were the 1930s. Its first voyage took place in 1936. Back then, it provided weekly express transportation between England, France, and New York. It carried passengers and mail and whatever else needed to be carried across the ocean. And it was seriously an amazing and really luxurious boat. It had Art Deco stylings and furnishings, and it even had elaborate carvings on the wooden walls. Here's a quick rundown of its very luxurious features. It had several dining rooms. It had a club called the Starlight Club that was only open at night. It had a music studio, swimming pools, dog kennels, a beauty salon, libraries, and it was the first ocean liner to have a Jewish prayer room. But when World War II started in 1939, things changed for the Queen Mary. After it finished its last regular passenger trip, it sat in New York awaiting its wartime orders. It sat there for 7 months. Its orders finally came in March of 1940. The Queen Mary's job was to travel to places around the world to pick up and drop off soldiers as needed. To use a boat word, it became a troop ship. A lot of changes had to be made before it got put to work, including, but not limited to, the following. All the cool decorations and objects were taken out, so no more Art Deco. All the cool wooden details inside got covered with leather. Pretty smart. And the whole ship got rigged up to be magnetically protected. And for all you magnetic protection fans, they protected it by wrapping a degaussing coil around the whole hull. Oh, and the outside got painted a drab color called light sea gray for camouflage, and the ship got the nickname the Gray Ghost. Very eerie in light of what happened on October 2nd, 1942. Clearly, lots of precautions were taken, but on that date, just off the Irish coast, something truly horrific happened. The Queen Mary was out there traveling, doing its troop transporting, and trying to stay out of trouble. Part of how it stayed out of trouble is that during this time, it was partnered with a much smaller escort ship called the HMS Curacao, not to be confused with Curacao. They were under orders not to stop no matter what because of the danger of U-boats. They were also, both ships, traveling a zigzag path for that same reason. Which sounds like it could only be a problem if there wasn't enough coordination and planning between the big boat and the little boat. And yep, you guessed it, that's exactly what happened. Apparently, they had not worked out which boat had the right-of-way. Instead of telling you what happened, I'm going to read a quotation from somebody who was on board the Queen Mary that day. I said to my mate, she's zigzagging all over the place in front of us. I'm sure we're going to hit her. And sure enough, the Queen Mary sliced the cruiser into like a piece of butter, straight through the 6-inch armored plating. That was from the account of Alfred Johnson, who was on board the Queen Mary. And now I want to read you what the Naval Historical Society of Australia wrote about the collision. At the moment of impact, as the Curaçao reeled in the water, many seamen on deck were thrown into the freezing water. Even as they resurfaced, they watched in horror as the stern quickly sank, taking with it the men trapped behind the watertight doors. The forward section followed soon after, leaving the men in the murky water surrounded by debris, oil, and drowned or mutilated bodies. It was every man for himself as survivors clung to floating wreckage. They were about 20 nautical miles off the Irish coast, which, had boats or rafts been launched, would have meant they were within easy reach of safety. Okay, so it shouldn't have been a huge deal. They just needed to get picked up, right? But remember, both ships were under strict orders to, under no circumstances, stop until the troops had been safely delivered. The captain of the Queen Mary followed those orders. The Queen Mary left the wreckage of the escort boat that it had just sliced in half behind, while the survivors watched in what must have been absolute shock and horror. The Queen Mary did, of course, report the accident to try to get help out to them, but reports vary as to when the accident was reported. Some say hours, some say minutes, but the ship had already sunk by the time help reached it, and most of the people that survived the initial crash had died in the water of hypothermia. At least 239 out of 338 people on board died that night, and some estimates are even higher. While I'm sure anybody who was involved on the Queen Mary side of that and survived must have not felt great about it, the matter did go to court years later, and the Queen Mary was cleared of any wrongdoing. At one of the hearings, the captain of the Curaçao, who, by the way, survived, he was asked if the captain of the Queen Mary made the right decision, and he said, "I would say yes." So the Queen Mary was innocent in the eyes of that captain and in the eyes of the law. And in fact, during World War II, the Queen Mary was kind of a hero. Its large capacity and high-speed travel were huge assets. Winston Churchill even said that the Queen Mary alone shortened the war by a year. In 1945, when the war ended and its work was over, the Queen Mary made its fastest ever trip across the Atlantic Ocean to get home. How very relatable of it. Between 1946 and 1947, the boat got a major post-war makeover. It was renovated to be Art Deco, opulent, and colorful again, and air conditioning was even added. Then it went back to what it was doing before, and it continued to do so through the mid-1960s. At that time, airplanes were becoming just too popular, and the Queen Mary was retired in 1967 after completing its 1,001st trip across the Atlantic and carrying over 2 million passengers in its life as an active ocean liner. And where was its final destination? Where is it now, living out its golden years? Long Beach, California. The town bought the ship for $3.45 million, and they planned to turn it into a hotel and tourist attraction, which is exactly what happened. It took several years to open, but finally in 1972, the Queen Mary officially opened as a hotel. Financially, though, everybody involved was losing a ton of money right off the bat, and way too many vendors and outside businesses were involved in the operation. It was essentially a floating money pit. In 1980, a local millionaire named Jack Rather signed a 66-year lease on the boat. Let me tell you about Jack Rather. In 1955, Walt Disney wanted to build a Disneyland hotel on the land that he owned in Long Beach, but he couldn't afford the actual construction of the hotel. So Walt Disney's workaround was that he leased the land that he owned very cheaply to Jack Rather, and he let Jack build the hotel. And build it he did. Walt Disney tried over and over to buy the hotel from Jack Rather once Disney had more money later down the road, but Jack never budged. I'll remind you that in 1980, Jack signed a 66-year lease on the Queen Mary, but he died 4 years after that. So Disney figured, okay, we can finally buy that Disneyland hotel. So they went to the Rather Group and tried to buy the hotel, but the Rather Group said, we'll sell you the hotel under one condition. You have to also buy the rest of the lease on the Queen Mary. And of course, Disney bought the Queen Mary lease, even though they really didn't want it. They tried to make the best of the situation by turning the boat into a mini theme park. This was 1988, by the way. Part of their mini theme park was that they had a bunch of themed tours of the boat. One of those tours was called Haunted Passages. Why, you ask? Because by 1988, the Queen Mary had a reputation for being creepy and for having at least 50 recorded deaths on board. Before I tell you about the rest of this Disney thing, I want to walk you through a few notable deaths and hauntings. This isn't a spoiler because I already told you, but I want to remind you that this does ultimately become a hotel again. And a lot of the reports of hauntings are from hotel guests after that happened. First up, there's a part of the boat called Shaft Alley that's the location of hatch door number 13. The thing you need to know about the hatch doors on the boat is that they closed with a watertight seal. One night in 1966, as part of a regular fire drill, the hatch doors were ordered to be closed. At the end of this fire drill, an 18-year-old crew member named John Petter was found crushed in hatch door number 13. But he wasn't dead. He had been stuck in the door for an estimated 5 minutes, and his arms, his chest, and his pelvis had been crushed. They took him to the hospital area where he pretty quickly died. Nowadays, in that hallway, people report seeing a guy wearing blue coveralls looking for his wrench, and then he disappears. Some people have noticed grease fingerprints on their face after being in that area of the ship, and people sometimes hear unexplained whistling in the area of hatch door number 13. Staff and guests have reported hauntings in quite a few other specific locations on the ship, in addition to hatch door number 13, including a boiler room and one of the old salons. But the first-class swimming pool and guest room B340 are said to be the most haunted. The swimming pool isn't in use now, but visitors can go look at it. At least one person died there, a little girl named Jackie. And people report seeing ghosts of a young woman who wears tennis clothes, an old woman in a wedding dress, and a little girl in a blue and white dress. Oh, and also, wet footprints are said to appear from time to time, even though the pool has been dry and crumbling for decades. But let's talk about room B340. This has been called the most haunted hotel room in California. But if you believe that the Queen Mary is the most haunted hotel in America, then of course that would make room B340 the most haunted hotel room in the whole country. It's been called a paranormal black hole. In 1948, when the Queen Mary was still an ocean liner, a third-class passenger died in the room. Could all that reported paranormal stuff be caused by just one guy who died back in 1948 and maybe even died of natural causes? But here's the other thing. In the late 60s, supposedly, a passenger on the ship murdered 2 women. He was caught and he was locked into his room. There was a guard stationed outside to make sure he didn't leave because the police were going to arrest him when they docked in New York the next morning. During the night, the guy started screaming and pounding on the door and saying that somebody was in there trying to kill him. Obviously, the guard thought the guy was trying to trick him because how could anybody have gotten in there when he had been standing guard the whole time? So the guard ignored the man in the room, and eventually the man stopped screaming. When they got to New York in the morning, the policemen came to arrest him, and when they opened the door, they found this guy literally ripped apart, limbs and entrails spread around the room. killed in a way that had made it pretty obvious that he had not done it to himself. But that's just one version of the story. Whatever actually happened, people are generally convinced that somebody was murdered around there. Hauntings supposedly started on the very next voyage in that area of the ship. And of course, that's the area that's now called Room B340. That's a pretty crazy story, and probably not a true one because there aren't any records or any official sources to be found. So, what's the actual story of Room B340? I want to go back to Disney's Haunted Passages tour that I mentioned before. Like I said, the ship already had kind of a creepy reputation because of the deaths that had happened on it and around it, and because of it, the Haunted Passages tour totally capitalized on all that. And, this is kind of revolting, the promo image for the tour was an image of a see-through John Petter standing in a boiler room. Remember, he's the teenager that got crushed to death at hatch door number 13. The Haunted Passages tour stopped at known sites of crew member and guest deaths, but the big deal tour stop was Room B340. The room wasn't being used at the time, so Disney tried to convert it to a mini haunted mansion. They installed audio and visual effects that were triggered when people entered the room. Things like creaky floorboards, faucets turning on, voices, and things appearing in mirrors. But ultimately, the Disney thing didn't work out. So they gave up their lease and they walked away in 1992. When Disney left the Queen Mary, they locked the door to room B340 behind them. And then, in 2008, Time magazine called the Queen Mary one of the 10 most haunted places in the world. What happened between the Haunted Passages tour days, when the Queen Mary was mostly haunted with AV effects, and that Time magazine piece claiming it was a top 10 most haunted place in the world? There are plenty of theories about this, but the one that I find most interesting is, of course, a really weird one. It's called the egregore theory. Basically, the idea in this context is that if somebody says enough times that a place is haunted, and if enough people then believe that it's haunted, it will actually become haunted. Greg Newkirk is a paranormal researcher who explained all this to the SF Gate. He said that he's seen cases where people have put so much intention and energy into thinking a place is haunted that it eventually becomes haunted by an egregore, which he said is a thought form created by decades of emotions pumped into a specific place or thing. Another paranormal researcher seconded this theory and added that the specific details surrounding the supposed ghosts on the boat add extra energy to the egregore. They say that since, for example, people can specifically focus on the image and the story of that eviscerated man in room B340, rather than just feeling like, ooh, this place is creepy, that somehow that specificity makes it more haunted and manifests more ghost energy. Like I said, the ship became a hotel again after Disney sold it. Since its most recent renovation, the hotel has begun providing things in room B340 to encourage this whole egregore thing. There's a Ouija board, tarot cards, ghost hunting equipment, pictures, and written stories of ghosts. And printed on the bathroom wall, directions for getting a hold of Bloody Mary, which used to terrify me when I was little. I mentioned earlier that B340 has been called a paranormal black hole. That was stated by somebody that was discussing this egregore theory. An article in Crescenta Valley Weekly has a fun take on it. If the tales are true that unbridled psychokinetic thought energy would charge the room to cause manifestations of nomadic spirits, that, to me, is even cooler than a haunt. But whatever happened in the room to give it its spirited beginnings, there is real activity in there now. Apparently, lots of guests have relatively recently reported ghostly things happening in that room. Covers being pulled off, clothes hangers rattling, but it's a boat, so I don't know about that one. People have reported seeing an apparition at the foot of their bed, hearing footsteps, and people knocking on the door throughout the night. But another thing I read is that groups of people will try to come and knock on the door to B340 in the middle of the night to try to communicate with ghosts. So maybe a different type of spirit is responsible for those. And if you're now fired up about visiting the Queen Mary, you're in luck. The ship closed temporarily in May 2020 because of COVID, and while it closed, the city of Long Beach hired a firm to assess it. And they learned that it was about to sink. $23 million worth of repairs had to be done, and urgently, in order to save it. There were fundraisers, even all the way over in Scotland, where the ship was from. And with contributions from a wide variety of sources, the ship was saved. And the Queen Mary reopened to the public in 2023. Most of it, at least. Room B340 is currently closed, and I'm not sure why, but it's going to officially reopen on September 13th, 2024, which is 10 days from when I'm recording this episode. So now's the time. Call them today. Yes, call them. Because here's the most haunting part of it all. If you're interested in booking room B340, you cannot do it online. You have to call on the phone to inquire. Woo! And I want to say, I know ghost stories aren't everybody's cup of tea. They're definitely mine, though. And regardless of whether or not you believe in ghosts, you have to admit that the Queen Mary has a pretty haunting history that starts at least as far back as when it chopped its own escort boat in half and left everybody to die. Maybe now it's only actually haunted by bad decor and overpriced boat food, but there's only one way to find out. And this is where I'll leave you. And I'll leave you with the strong suggestion to please try to convince me to go stay on the Queen Mary, because I really want to, but I'm too scared. Until next time, stay curious, don't zigzag, and look out for watertight doors. This theme song was written and recorded by Clark Blomquist. Okay, I'm jumping back in here with an update. After I finished recording this, I got brave and called the Queen Mary to ask about room B340. Here's what happened. I had to go through several menus of robots, but I eventually spoke with a very friendly, very human person who told me that yes, the room is reopening, but it won't be available for overnight stays. The silver lining is that the room will be available for tours, and self-guided tours are free with a room reservation. So what I'm hearing is that hotel guests can go into that room whenever they want and then return to the safety of their less haunted room when they get too scared, which actually sounds kind of ideal to me.